Hello guys! Today we're embarking on a fascinating journey through the Silk Road, discovering how precious gifts and goods crossed entire continents in ancient times, facing unimaginable challenges that make our modern express deliveries seem absolutely trivial. You're going to uncover the secrets behind the most ambitious trade in human history, understand how completely different cultures connected through endless caravans, and see surprising parallels with our globalized world today. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, consider subscribing to help our community grow and get notifications whenever we post new stories. Comment from where you're watching and what time it is there. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is spread around the world. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's dive into this incredible story together. The Silk Road was never just a road. It was a complex web of intertwined paths that stretched over 7,000 kilometers, connecting the Mediterranean to the Far East through scorching deserts, icy mountains, and endless plains. Imagine trying to coordinate an international delivery today without the internet, without phones, without precise maps, without reliable weather forecasts. The merchants who dared to travel these routes weren't just transporting goods, they were literally risking their lives at every kilometer, relying on knowledge passed down through generations, on stars for navigation, and on the kindness of strangers in distant lands where even the smell of the air was different. The term Silk Road was only coined in the 19th century by a German geographer, but the routes themselves had existed for millennia. From around 200 years before the Common Era, caravans were already crossing Central Asia, carrying not just Chinese silk, though that was the most coveted commodity, but also spices from India, whose aromas could make a man salivate instantly, Roman glass so fine it seemed to capture the sunlight itself, Persian horses with rippling muscles, gemstones that caught rainbows in their facets, Egyptian papyri covered in mysterious hieroglyphs, and countless other treasures. Each item carried with it stories of skilled artisans whose calloused fingers worked by the light of oil lamps, secret techniques guarded like treasures, and the sweat of workers whose names were never recorded by history. Think about it. How many hands touched a single roll of silk before it reached its final destination? Dozens. Hundreds. Merchants rarely traveled the entire length of the route. That would have been impractical and taken years. Instead, it worked like a commercial relay race. A Chinese merchant would carry his goods to an outpost on the western border, maybe Dunhuang, where Buddhist temples guarded ancient manuscripts, or Kashgar, where the air always carried the scent of roasted lamb with cumin. There, in covered markets, where sunlight filtered through straw roofs, creating dancing patterns on the ground, he would sell to Sogdian merchants, the ultimate middlemen of the Silk Road, men who spoke half a dozen languages with equal fluency. These Sogdians would take the goods through Central Asia, crossing deserts where sandstorms could arise out of nowhere, turning day into night in minutes. Then Persian merchants would take over, crossing the Iranian plateau, where cities like Isfahan shone like jewels set in arid landscapes, their rose-scented gardens offering respite from the relentless heat. Finally, Arab, Armenian, or Syrian traders would complete the journey to the bustling Mediterranean markets, where the smell of fresh fish mixed with exotic perfumes and the shouts of vendors in dozens of languages created a chaotic symphony of trade. Each handover meant complex negotiations carried out in caravanserais, magnificent structures built to house caravans with central courtyards surrounded by simple rooms, stables for animals, and always a fresh water fountain in the center, its constant murmur a heavenly music to tired ears. Imagine setting a fair price when you don't speak the other merchant's language, when there's no universally accepted currency, when quality has to be assessed without international standards. Merchants developed elaborate systems of hand gestures and often resorted to direct bartering. A roll of Chinese silk might be traded for Persian horses, which in turn would be traded for Roman glass, which eventually would be traded for Indian spices. It was a commercial dance of impressive complexity, functioning without written contracts, based purely on reputation and trust. Trust was the most valuable currency on the Silk Road. A merchant who cheated his partners would quickly find that no caravan would accept him, no caravanserais would give him shelter, no guide would agree to work for him. News traveled surprisingly fast along the routes, carried by travelers and pilgrims. Your reputation arrived at destinations before you did. It's not so different from online reviews today, is it? We still rely on digital reputation to decide who to trust, which product to buy, which service to hire. The technology has changed, but the fundamental human need to trust before transacting remains exactly the same. Preparations for a journey began months before the actual departure. Merchants needed to gather enough capital, often forming partnerships to share costs and risks. They needed to hire armed guards, essential for protection against bandits. They needed to acquire pack animals, Bactrian camels for the deserts, creatures that could go days without water, long-haired yaks for the mountains, animals that endured extreme cold, mules for varied terrain. Each animal had advantages and limitations. Camels could go days without water, but were temperamental. Yaks endured cold but couldn't tolerate heat. Mules were versatile but less resilient over long distances. The choice of what to transport was strategic. Goods needed to have high value relative to weight and volume, be relatively durable, and have guaranteed demand at the destination. Silk fit perfectly. Lightweight, compact, reasonably durable, and universally desired. Spices were also ideal. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves took up little space but were worth fortunes. Gemstones were any merchant's dream, immense value in tiny packages that could be hidden in secret pockets. But what about the gifts? In ancient societies, gifts weren't just acts of kindness, they were essential diplomatic tools, demonstrations of power, and investments in future relationships. Rulers sent elaborate gifts to other rulers, silks embroidered with gold threads destined for distant emperors, carved Chinese jade for Persian kings, purebred Arab horses for Chinese nobles, illuminated manuscripts, exotic musical instruments, even rare animals like leopards, falcons, and peacocks, whose iridescent feathers seemed to capture fragments of the rainbow. The logistics of transporting a live gift across thousands of kilometers was a nightmare. Imagine keeping a leopard alive, fed, and relatively calm during months of travel. The animal needed a strong but lightweight cage, constant clean water, regular exercise, and protection from extreme weather, or ensuring that a rare hunting falcon, a nervous and sensitive bird, arrived in perfect condition. These gifts required dedicated caretakers, specific feed, and constant attention. Failure wasn't an option. Presenting a dead gift to a powerful ruler could result in disastrous diplomatic consequences or even the execution of the messenger. The seasons dictated when caravans could depart. Spring and autumn were ideal. Moderate temperatures, fewer sandstorms, accessible mountain passes. Summer meant deadly heat in the deserts, where temperatures exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. The sun became a relentless enemy, turning metal into embers. Men traveled at night when possible, sleeping during the day under tents. Winter made mountain passes impassable, with snow piling up meters high and temperatures dropping to 20, 30 degrees below zero. A caravan caught by surprise in a snowstorm simply vanished, its members freezing to death, its goods lost forever. Route planning was a complex science passed down through generations. Experienced merchants memorized the location of every water well, every oasis, every caravanserai. They knew exactly How many days of travel separated each resupply point? They carried enough water to reach the next well, but no more. Water is heavy, and every extra kilo meant less space for profitable goods. Miscalculate, and people and animals died of thirst in the desert. Today we plan routes with GPS. We have apps that tell us where the next gas station is. They had only memory, experience, and the stars to guide them. Psychological preparation was as important as the physical. Merchants knew they would spend months, sometimes years, away from their families. They knew many never returned, dead from diseases, accidents, bandits, or simply vanished. They made wills, left instructions for their families, visited sacred sites to pray for protection. Some carried amulets, talismans, religious texts. Faith was an essential comfort in the face of absolute uncertainty that awaited them. The farewells were community events. Entire families gathered to see the caravans off. There were blessings from religious leaders, traditional music, tears, and prolonged hugs. Children ran alongside the caravans for the first kilometers, waving until the camels disappeared on the horizon. Wives and mothers didn't know if they would see their men again. Merchants didn't know if they would return rich or ruined, or if they would return. It was an act of extraordinary courage just to decide to leave. But why did they do it? Some sought wealth. A single successful trip could make a man rich for life. Others were driven by curiosity, by the desire to see distant lands, meet different peoples. Some were born adventurers, unable to settle for a sedentary life. And others simply came from merchant families, continuing a tradition that went back generations. Each carried their own motivations, their own dreams, their own fears. As the caravans set off, the bells on the camels tinkling rhythmically, the wheels of the wagons creaking, the voices of the drivers echoing commands, a journey began that would test every fiber of endurance. The familiar gradually gave way to the unknown. The last known settlements disappeared behind them. Ahead stretched only vastness, deserts that seemed infinite, mountains that touched the sky, and thousands of kilometers of uncertainty. But also opportunity, also wonder, also the possibility of returning with stories that would be told for generations, with riches that would transform lives, with experiences that no amount of gold could buy. And you, comfortably watching this video, are probably surrounded by objects that traveled thousands of kilometers to reach you. But how much do you really know about those modern journeys? The ancient Silk Road and our modern supply chains are more alike than you think, and in the next chapters, you're going to discover exactly how. The first days of the journey were always the most challenging, not necessarily because of physical dangers, but because of the psychological adjustment everyone had to make. The body hadn't yet found its rhythm, muscles ached from repetitive movements, and the mind fought against the constant temptation to look back, to reconsider, to question the wisdom of leaving. Experienced merchants knew this adjustment period and understood that it would take about a week before the caravan truly settled into its routine, before each person and animal found their natural place in the order of things. The hierarchy within a caravan was complex and essential for survival. At the top was the caravan leader, usually the most experienced merchant, or the one who had contributed the most capital. His word was absolute law on matters of route, travel speed, and when to stop or continue. Below him came the individual merchants, each responsible for their own goods and animals. Then came the guards, tough men hired specifically for protection, who slept in shifts and kept constant watch. There were also animal handlers, experts at dealing with temperamental camels or stubborn mules, cooks who prepared communal meals. Occasionally there were specialized artisans, a blacksmith who could fix horseshoes or repair broken equipment, a healer who knew medicinal herbs, a veterinarian for the animals. Everyone had their role, and the survival of all depended on each one performing their duties properly. There was no room for excessive individualism or prolonged conflicts. Disputes were resolved quickly, usually by the caravan leader whose decisions were final. It was a temporary but intensely interdependent society where bonds formed quickly under shared pressure. Men who were complete strangers at the start of the journey often became lifelong friends or bitter enemies, depending on how they interacted during months of forced proximity. The desert stretching out before the caravans departing from the eastern regions was a living, breathing entity that changed mood and appearance with the hours of the day. At dawn, when the sun was still just a promise on the eastern horizon, the desert was surprisingly cold, the crisp air making men pull their cloaks tighter around their bodies. The sand, which would be unbearably hot in a few hours, was icy to the touch. The sky went through a spectacular transformation of colors, first a pale gray, then soft pink, vibrant orange, and finally the intense blue that would dominate until sunset. As the sun rose, its presence became increasingly oppressive. The heat didn't just come from above, but seemed to emanate from the sand itself, creating visible waves in the air that distorted vision and created cruel mirages. Imaginary oases appeared on the horizon, so convincing that even experienced merchants sometimes had to consciously remind themselves they weren't real. Crystal clear lakes promising relief vanished as you approached, revealing themselves as nothing more than tricks of light and heat. These illusions were more than mere curiosities. They could be dangerous, leading desperate travelers to stray from safe routes in search of water that didn't exist. The desert sand wasn't uniform. There were regions of fine sand like talcum powder, so light that the wind lifted it into clouds that penetrated everything, getting into eyes, nostrils, mouths, finding their way through clothes to the skin. There were areas of coarser sand, almost like small pebbles that crunched under feet and hooves. There were stretches of massive dunes rising like frozen waves of a golden ocean, some reaching up to 100 meters high, their sharp crests like blades against the sky. Crossing these dunes was exhausting. Each step sank into the loose sand, making leg muscles burn with effort, turning what would be a minutes-long walk on firm ground into an hours-long ordeal. And there was the wind. Sometimes it was just a gentle breeze, offering welcome relief from the heat. But other times it turned into something much more sinister. Sandstorms could arise with little warning, starting as a dark line on the horizon that quickly expanded and approached. Experienced merchants recognized the signs: a sudden change in air pressure, an eerie silence where there had been the constant sound of a light breeze before, a particular quality to the light. When those signs appeared, the caravan stopped immediately, no matter the time or place. There was no time to search for ideal shelter. When a sandstorm hit, the world disappeared. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. The air became a solid mass of moving sand, impossible to breathe without protection. Men and animals huddled down, covering themselves with whatever fabric was available, tying cloths over faces, closing eyes tightly. The roar of the wind was deafening, making communication impossible. The sand whipped exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. All you could do was wait, endure, and pray. The storm passed quickly. Some lasted minutes, others hours. The worst could last days, forcing caravans to remain motionless, consuming precious supplies without making progress, testing everyone's patience and nerves. After a storm, the recovery work began. Sand had to be shaken from everything: clothes, equipment, bags of goods. Animals needed to be carefully checked, their eyes and nostrils cleaned of accumulated sand. Supplies had to be recounted to assess what was lost or damaged. And then, perhaps the most challenging, the caravan had to reorient itself. Sandstorms could completely alter the landscape, moving entire dunes, burying landmarks merchants used for navigation, creating new formations where there had been flat ground before. More than one caravan got lost after a severe storm, its members wandering in circles until water and food ran out. Water was the constant obsession in the desert. Every sip was measured, rationed, more precious than any goods they carried. Leather water skins, some so large they needed 2 men to carry when full, were constantly checked for leaks. Losing water from a damaged skin could mean the difference between life and death. The water tasted of leather and was often lukewarm, almost hot, but it was delicious to parched throats. Drinking too much too fast could cause painful cramps. Drinking too little led to dangerous dehydration. Finding the right balance was a skill learned through experience, sometimes painful. The water wells scattered across the desert were more than just sources of water. They were social hubs, meeting places where caravans from different directions crossed paths. Some wells were just simple holes dug in the sand where groundwater collected, often brackish and unpleasant tasting, but still drinkable in desperation. Others were more elaborate structures, built and maintained by local communities or rulers who recognized the importance of facilitating trade. These better wells had stone or brick walls, pulley systems to lower buckets, and sometimes even roofs to provide shade. Arriving at a well after days in the desert was an experience of profound relief. Men and animals drank greedily, filling their bodies with the vital liquid. Water skins were meticulously refilled. There was always an established order. Usually, the caravans that arrived first had priority, but rules of hospitality dictated that no one could be denied access to water, no matter how late they arrived or how crowded the area around the well was. Conflicts occasionally arose, especially when multiple large caravans converged simultaneously on a well with limited supply, but most merchants understood that cooperation served everyone better in the long run. At the wells, information was exchanged as eagerly as water. Merchants shared news about conditions on the routes ahead, where recent storms had made travel difficult, where bandits had been spotted, which caravanserais had good supplies available, which cities were paying good prices for specific goods. This information was valuable, sometimes determining whether a journey would be profitable or disastrous. There were also gossip, stories, rumors, some true, many exaggerated, some completely fabricated. Separating fact from fiction required judgment and experience. At night, the desert transformed completely. The temperature dropped dramatically, sometimes 20 or 30 degrees, in just a few hours after sunset. Men who had sweated under the relentless sun during the day now shivered, adding layers of clothing, gathering around campfires. The fires were fueled with whatever was available, wood when they could find it, dried animal dung when they couldn't. The dancing flames provided warmth, light for preparing meals, and a psychological center around which the caravan's temporary community gathered. Meals were simple but essential: cooked grains, wheat, barley, rice, depending on the region of origin. Flatbread baked on hot stones. Occasionally, dried meat or salted fish brought from home. More rarely, when luck allowed, fresh meat from an animal hunted during the day: a desert hare, a large lizard, rarely a gazelle if the hunters were particularly skilled. Fresh vegetables were rare luxuries, savored intensely when available. Dates and other dried fruits provided sweetness and concentrated energy. Tea was prepared whenever possible, its warmth and mild stimulation welcome. After meals came the stories. This was perhaps the most important part of desert nights, the moment when the caravan became more than a collection of individuals united by commercial convenience and transformed into a temporary community with shared culture. Veteran merchants told tales of past journeys, dangers faced and overcome, fortunes won and lost, exotic places visited, extraordinary people met. Some stories were true, others embellished with each retelling, some completely made up, but too entertaining to question. There were stories of ghost caravans, groups of travelers who had vanished without a trace, only to be sighted years later by other caravans, still wandering the desert, trapped in some kind of eternal curse or illusion. There were stories of hidden treasures, valuable goods buried by caravans in peril, their locations marked but later lost when no one survived to retrieve them. Stories of secret oases known only to a few, where water flowed abundantly and fruit trees grew dense. Stories of desert creatures, some real like scorpions the size of human hands, or venomous snakes that hid under the sand. Others mythical like jinns that could take human form, or desert demons that drove lone travelers mad. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, obviously helping to pass the long nights, but they also educated, transmitting practical knowledge disguised as narrative. A story about a caravan that perished because it ignored storm signs taught vigilance. A story about merchants who were cheated in a distant city taught caution in negotiations. And the stories created bonds, giving caravan members shared experiences, common references, a sense of being part of something larger than themselves, a tradition of trade and travel that stretched across centuries. The night sky in the desert was a spectacle few experience today. Without light pollution, without glowing cities on the horizon, the stars appeared in impossible numbers, so dense in some areas they seemed to form luminous clouds. The Milky Way stretched like a shining road across the sky. Merchants used these stars for navigation, knowing constellations and their positions at different times of year with precision that rivaled any modern instrument. The North Star pointed north with unchanging reliability. Other stars and constellations marked east, west, south. The moon in its various phases provided additional light and another way to mark time. But the desert night also had its dangers. Nocturnal animals emerged, scorpions, spiders, snakes, all potentially lethal. Men learned to shake out their boots before putting them on in the morning, to check their sleeping bags before lying down, to never put their hands in places they couldn't see clearly. Extreme cold was another danger, capable of causing hypothermia if someone wasn't properly prepared. And there was the psychological danger of the vastness and darkness, which could make men feel insignificant, lost, questioning their choices and their sanity. Guards kept watch through the night in rotating shifts. Their eyes constantly scanned the darkness beyond the firelight circle, looking for movement, for signs of danger. Bandits preferred to attack at night when they had the element of surprise. Wild animals occasionally approached, drawn by the smell of food or simply curious. An alert guard could mean the difference between waking safely at dawn or waking surrounded by enemies, or not waking at all. Sleep, when it finally came, was often restless. The hard ground, even with blankets or mats spread out, was never truly comfortable. Night sounds, the distant howl of jackals, the rustle of something moving in the sand, the snoring of fellow travelers, the occasional bellow of an unhappy camel, interrupted rest. Dreams were vivid and strange, perhaps influenced by physical exhaustion, limited diet, or simply the surreal nature of being so completely removed from normal life. Men dreamed of their homes, their families, abundant meals and soft beds. They woke to the harsh reality of the desert, and for a moment the contrast was almost unbearable before determination and necessity took control again. Dawn brought relief and renewal. The first rays of sun, still soft and golden, were welcome after the night's cold. The caravan woke gradually, first the guards from the last shift, then the cooks preparing a simple morning meal, then the other members one by one. There was an established routine that repeated with small variations each morning. Animals needed to be checked, fed, and prepared for the day. Equipment needed to be inspected for damage. Loads needed to be readjusted and balanced. The morning meal was consumed quickly. There was no time for lingering, when every hour of daylight was precious. And then, with the sun still low on the horizon, the caravan set off again. The first steps of the day were always the hardest, muscles stiff from nighttime rest, protesting the renewed movement. But gradually, as bodies warmed up and found their rhythm, the motion became easier, almost meditative. The tinkling of camel bells, the creaking of leather and wood, the muffled sound of hooves and feet on the sand. These sounds formed the constant soundtrack of days in the desert. Have you ever stopped to think about how your life is governed by convenience? Water flows from taps with a simple turn. Food is available in stores anytime. Temperature is controlled by thermostats. Information is a click away. For the Silk Road merchants, each of these things you take for granted required immense effort, careful planning, and often luck. They lived in a world where nothing was guaranteed, where each day brought new challenges, where survival depended on skill, knowledge, and resilience. And yet they persevered, pushing through deserts that seemed endless, motivated by dreams of profit, adventure, or simply the determination to complete what they'd started. There's something deeply human in that persistence, in that refusal to give up, even when everything seems impossible. It's a quality that transcends time and culture, connecting those ancient merchants with anyone today facing their own metaphorical deserts, their own challenges that seem insurmountable until they are, step by step, overcome. The first days of the journey were always the most challenging, not necessarily because of physical dangers, but because of the psychological adjustment everyone had to make. The body hadn't yet found its rhythm, muscles ached from repetitive movements, and the mind fought against the constant temptation to look back, to reconsider, to question the wisdom of leaving. Experienced merchants knew this adjustment period and understood that it would take about a week before the caravan truly settled into its routine, before each person and animal found their natural place in the order of things. The hierarchy within a caravan was complex and essential for survival. At the top was the caravan leader, usually the most experienced merchant, or the one who had contributed the most capital. His word was absolute law on matters of route, travel speed, and when to stop or continue. Below him came the individual merchants, each responsible for their own goods and animals. Then came the guards, tough men hired specifically for protection, who slept in shifts and kept constant watch. There were also animal handlers, experts at dealing with temperamental camels or stubborn mules, cooks who prepared communal meals. Occasionally there were specialized artisans, a blacksmith who could fix horseshoes or repair broken equipment, a healer who knew medicinal herbs, a veterinarian for the animals. Everyone had their role, and the survival of all depended on each one performing their duties properly. There was no room for excessive individualism or prolonged conflicts. Disputes were resolved quickly, usually by the caravan leader whose decisions were final. It was a temporary but intensely interdependent society where bonds formed quickly under shared pressure. Men who were complete strangers at the start of the journey often became lifelong friends or bitter enemies, depending on how they interacted during months of forced proximity. The desert stretching out before the caravans departing from the eastern regions was a living, breathing entity that changed mood and appearance with the hours of the day. At dawn, when the sun was still just a promise on the eastern horizon, the desert was surprisingly cold, the crisp air making men pull their cloaks tighter around their bodies. The sand, which would be unbearably hot in a few hours, was icy to the touch. The sky went through a spectacular transformation of colors, first a pale gray, then soft pink, vibrant orange, and finally the intense blue that would dominate until sunset. As the sun rose, its presence became increasingly oppressive. The heat didn't just come from above, but seemed to emanate from the sand itself, creating visible waves in the air that distorted vision and created cruel mirages. Imaginary oases appeared on the horizon, so convincing that even experienced merchants sometimes had to consciously remind themselves they weren't real. Crystal clear lakes promising relief vanished as you approached, revealing themselves as nothing more than tricks of light and heat. These illusions were more than mere curiosities. They could be dangerous, leading desperate travelers to stray from safe routes in search of water that didn't exist. The desert sand wasn't uniform. There were regions of fine sand like talcum powder, so light that the wind lifted it into clouds that penetrated everything, getting into eyes, nostrils, mouths, finding their way through clothes to the skin. There were areas of coarser sand, almost like small pebbles that crunched under feet and hooves. There were stretches of massive dunes rising like frozen waves of a golden ocean, some reaching up to 100 meters high, their sharp crests like blades against the sky. Crossing these dunes was exhausting. Each step sank into the loose sand, making leg muscles burn with effort, turning what would be a minutes-long walk on firm ground into an hours-long ordeal. And there was the wind. Sometimes it was just a gentle breeze, offering welcome relief from the heat. But other times it turned into something much more sinister. Sandstorms could arise with little warning, starting as a dark line on the horizon that quickly expanded and approached. Experienced merchants recognized the signs: a sudden change in air pressure, an eerie silence where there had been the constant sound of a light breeze before, a particular quality to the light. When those signs appeared, the caravan stopped immediately, no matter the time or place. There was no time to search for ideal shelter. When a sandstorm hit, the world disappeared. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. The air became a solid mass of moving sand, impossible to breathe without protection. Men and animals huddled down, covering themselves with whatever fabric was available, tying cloths over faces, closing eyes tightly. The roar of the wind was deafening, making communication impossible. The sand whipped exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. All you could do was wait, endure, and pray. The storm passed quickly. Some lasted minutes, others hours. The worst could last days, forcing caravans to remain motionless, consuming precious supplies without making progress, testing everyone's patience and nerves. After a storm, the recovery work began. Sand had to be shaken from everything: clothes, equipment, bags of goods. Animals needed to be carefully checked, their eyes and nostrils cleaned of accumulated sand. Supplies had to be recounted to assess what was lost or damaged. And then, perhaps the most challenging, the caravan had to reorient itself. Sandstorms could completely alter the landscape, moving entire dunes, burying landmarks merchants used for navigation, creating new formations where there had been flat ground before. More than one caravan got lost after a severe storm, its members wandering in circles until water and food ran out. Water was the constant obsession in the desert. Every sip was measured, rationed, more precious than any goods they carried. Leather water skins, some so large they needed 2 men to carry when full, were constantly checked for leaks. Losing water from a damaged skin could mean the difference between life and death. The water tasted of leather and was often lukewarm, almost hot, but it was delicious to parched throats. Drinking too much too fast could cause painful cramps. Drinking too little led to dangerous dehydration. Finding the right balance was a skill learned through experience, sometimes painful. The water wells scattered across the desert were more than just sources of water. They were social hubs, meeting places where caravans from different directions crossed paths. Some wells were just simple holes dug in the sand where groundwater collected, often brackish and unpleasant tasting, but still drinkable in desperation. Others were more elaborate structures, built and maintained by local communities or rulers, who recognized the importance of facilitating trade. These better wells had stone or brick walls, pulley systems to lower buckets, and sometimes even roofs to provide shade. Arriving at a well after days in the desert was an experience of profound relief. Men and animals drank greedily, filling their bodies with the vital liquid. Water skins were meticulously refilled. There was always an established order. Usually, the caravans that arrived first had priority, but rules of hospitality dictated that no one could be denied access to water, no matter how late they arrived or how crowded the area around the well was. Conflicts occasionally arose, especially when multiple large caravans converged simultaneously on a well with limited supply, but most merchants understood that cooperation served everyone better in the long run. At the wells, information was exchanged as eagerly as water. Merchants shared news about conditions on the routes ahead, where recent storms had made travel difficult, where bandits had been spotted, which caravanserais had good supplies available, which cities were paying good prices for specific goods. This information was valuable, sometimes determining whether a journey would be profitable or disastrous. There were also gossip, stories, rumors, some true, many exaggerated, some completely fabricated. Separating fact from fiction required judgment and experience. At night, the desert transformed completely. The temperature dropped dramatically, sometimes 20 or 30 degrees, in just a few hours after sunset. Men who had sweated under the relentless sun during the day now shivered, adding layers of clothing, gathering around campfires. The fires were fueled with whatever was available, wood when they could find it, dried animal dung when they couldn't. The dancing flames provided warmth, light for preparing meals, and a psychological center around which the caravan's temporary community gathered. Meals were simple but essential: cooked grains, wheat, barley, rice, depending on the region of origin. Flatbread baked on hot stones. Occasionally, dried meat or salted fish brought from home. More rarely, when luck allowed, fresh meat from an animal hunted during the day: a desert hare, a large lizard, rarely a gazelle if the hunters were particularly skilled. Fresh vegetables were rare luxuries, savored intensely when available. Dates and other dried fruits provided sweetness and concentrated energy. Tea was prepared whenever possible, its warmth and mild stimulation welcome. After meals came the stories. This was perhaps the most important part of desert nights, the moment when the caravan became more than a collection of individuals united by commercial convenience and transformed into a temporary community with shared culture. Veteran merchants told tales of past journeys, dangers faced and overcome, fortunes won and lost, exotic places visited, extraordinary people met. Some stories were true, others embellished with each retelling, some completely made up, but too entertaining to question. There were stories of ghost caravans, groups of travelers who had vanished without a trace, only to be sighted years later by other caravans, still wandering the desert, trapped in some kind of eternal curse or illusion. There were stories of hidden treasures, valuable goods buried by caravans in peril, their locations marked but later lost when no one survived to retrieve them. Stories of secret oases known only to a few, where water flowed abundantly and fruit trees grew dense. Stories of desert creatures, some real like scorpions the size of human hands, or venomous snakes that hid under the sand, others mythical like jinns that could take human form, or desert demons that drove lone travelers mad. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, obviously helping to pass the long nights, but they also educated, transmitting practical knowledge disguised as narrative. A story about a caravan that perished because it ignored storm signs taught vigilance. A story about merchants who were cheated in a distant city taught caution in negotiations. And the stories created bonds, giving caravan members shared experiences, common references, a sense of being part of something larger than themselves, a tradition of trade and travel that stretched across centuries. The night sky in the desert was a spectacle few experience today. Without light pollution, without glowing cities on the horizon, the stars appeared in impossible numbers, so dense in some areas they seemed to form luminous clouds. The Milky Way stretched like a shining road across the sky. Merchants used these stars for navigation, knowing constellations and their positions at different times of year with precision that rivaled any modern instrument. The North Star pointed north with unchanging reliability. Other stars and constellations marked east, west, south. The moon in its various phases provided additional light and another way to mark time. But the desert night also had its dangers. Nocturnal animals emerged, scorpions, spiders, snakes, all potentially lethal. Men learned to shake out their boots before putting them on in the morning, to check their sleeping bags before lying down, to never put their hands in places they couldn't see clearly. Extreme cold was another danger, capable of causing hypothermia if someone wasn't properly prepared. And there was the psychological danger of the vastness and darkness, which could make men feel insignificant, lost, questioning their choices and their sanity. Guards kept watch through the night in rotating shifts. Their eyes constantly scanned the darkness beyond the firelight circle, looking for movement, for signs of danger. Bandits preferred to attack at night when they had the element of surprise. Wild animals occasionally approached, drawn by the smell of food or simply curious. An alert guard could mean the difference between waking safely at dawn or waking surrounded by enemies, or not waking at all. Sleep, when it finally came, was often restless. The hard ground, even with blankets or mats spread out, was never truly comfortable. Night sounds, the distant howl of jackals, the rustle of something moving in the sand, the snoring of fellow travelers, the occasional bellow of an unhappy camel, interrupted rest. Dreams were vivid and strange, perhaps influenced by physical exhaustion, limited diet, or simply the surreal nature of being so completely removed from normal life. Men dreamed of their homes, their families, abundant meals and soft beds. They woke to the harsh reality of the desert, and for a moment the contrast was almost unbearable before determination and necessity took control again. Dawn brought relief and renewal. The first rays of sun, still soft and golden, were welcome after the night's cold. The caravan woke gradually, first the guards from the last shift, then the cooks preparing a simple morning meal, then the other members one by one. There was an established routine that repeated with small variations each morning. Animals needed to be checked, fed, and prepared for the day. Equipment needed to be inspected for damage. Loads needed to be readjusted and balanced. The morning meal was consumed quickly. There was no time for lingering, when every hour of daylight was precious. And then, with the sun still low on the horizon, the caravan set off again. The first steps of the day were always the hardest, muscles stiff from nighttime rest, protesting the renewed movement. But gradually, as bodies warmed up and found their rhythm, the motion became easier, almost meditative. The tinkling of camel bells, the creaking of leather and wood, the muffled sound of hooves and feet on the sand. These sounds formed the constant soundtrack of days in the desert. Have you ever stopped to think about how your life is governed by convenience? Water flows from taps with a simple turn. Food is available in stores anytime. Temperature is controlled by thermostats. Information is a click away. For the Silk Road merchants, each of these things you take for granted required immense effort, careful planning, and often luck. They lived in a world where nothing was guaranteed, where each day brought new challenges, where survival depended on skill, knowledge, and resilience. And yet they persevered, pushing through deserts that seemed endless, motivated by dreams of profit, adventure, or simply the determination to complete what they'd started. There's something deeply human in that persistence, in that refusal to give up, even when everything seems impossible. It's a quality that transcends time and culture, connecting those ancient merchants with anyone today facing their own metaphorical deserts, their own challenges that seem insurmountable until they are, step by step, overcome. If the desert tested endurance through heat, thirst, and monotony, the mountains tested it through extreme cold, thin air, and constant physical danger. The transition from desert to mountains was gradual on some routes, abrupt on others. Low hills gave way to higher elevations, which eventually turned into massive peaks that seemed to tear the sky itself. The mountain ranges the Silk Road crossed were among the highest and most inhospitable on the planet: the Pamir, the Hindu Kush, the Tian Shan, the Karakoram. Mountains where the air was so thin that breathing became a conscious effort, where temperatures could drop to levels that froze exposed flesh in minutes, where a single misstep could mean a fall of hundreds of meters. Preparation for crossing mountains was as intense as preparation for crossing deserts, but it required completely different equipment and strategies. Lightweight desert clothes were replaced by heavy layers of wool and furs. Camels, so valuable in the desert, were often traded for yaks, those extraordinary animals covered in thick, long fur, with hooves adapted for rocky and uneven terrain, capable of functioning at altitudes where horses and camels simply couldn't get enough oxygen. Local guides were essential, men who had been born in the mountains and knew every pass, every danger, every subtle shift in weather that foreshadowed storms. Mountain trails were terrifying. Many were little more than narrow paths, carved into cliff faces, with solid rock on one side and sheer drops on the other. There were no railings, no protections, just the narrow path and the need for absolute focus with every step. Animals had to be led individually or in single file, each carefully following the one ahead. A frightened animal that panicked could fall, taking its valuable load and possibly other tethered animals with it. Merchants learned not to look down, to keep their eyes fixed on the path immediately ahead, to trust their guides and their own instincts honed through experience. Bridges were often necessary to cross deep gorges or mountain rivers that ran fast and icy with meltwater from glaciers. Some bridges were relatively solid structures of wood and stone, maintained by local communities that charged tolls for upkeep. Others were far more precarious constructions, ropes braided from plant fibers or leather strips, with wooden planks irregularly spaced, forming a walking surface that swayed and creaked terrifyingly with every step. Crossing these rope bridges was an ordeal that tested the nerves of even the bravest. Winds made the bridges swing violently. Below, rivers roared over rocks, or there was just emptiness, drops of tens or hundreds of meters to rocky valley bottoms. Animals often refused to cross these bridges, their instincts screaming danger. They had to be blindfolded, led gently but firmly, sometimes literally pushed. Some simply couldn't be convinced and had to be left behind or taken on longer alternative routes. Occasionally, bridges failed, rotted ropes snapped, planks broke under weight. When that happened, the results were usually fatal. Bodies were rarely recovered from deep gorges. Goods were lost forever. Survivors could only offer prayers for the dead and press on, carrying the trauma, but unable to afford the luxury of stopping to grieve properly. The air at extreme altitudes was the most insidious invisible enemy. As caravans climbed, oxygen became progressively scarcer. Breathing grew difficult, each inhalation seeming to provide less air than the last. Hearts beat faster, trying to compensate, causing uncomfortable palpitations. Headaches were common, ranging from mild annoyances to debilitating agony. Nausea afflicted many, making eating difficult just when the body needed extra calories to generate heat and energy. Some developed more serious conditions, pulmonary or cerebral edema, where fluids built up in the lungs or brain, conditions that could be fatal if not treated by descending quickly to lower altitudes. Mountain inhabitants born and raised at these altitudes had physiological adaptations that allowed them to function normally where visitors struggled. Their bodies produced more red blood cells to transport oxygen more efficiently. Their lungs were larger, their respiratory capacities increased. They moved with ease where lowlanders staggered, gasping. These mountain populations played crucial roles as guides, porters, and suppliers of altitude-adapted animals. Without their help, crossing the Great Ranges would have been impossible for most caravans. The cold in the mountains was of a different quality from the desert's nighttime chill. It was more penetrating, more relentless, exacerbated by winds that blew constantly at high elevations. These winds could be so strong they literally knocked people and animals over, hurling them off cliffs or simply pinning them down and making it impossible to get up again. The wind chill factor turned already brutal temperatures into something truly deadly. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Fingers and toes were particularly vulnerable, blood flow to extremities diminishing as the body tried to preserve heat for vital organs. Frostbite was common, resulting in blackened fingers and toes that eventually fell off, leaving merchants maimed but alive if they were lucky. Staying warm required constant effort. Fires were hard to make in the mountains where wood was scarce and thin air made combustion less efficient. When fires were possible, everyone huddled around them, absorbing every bit of heat. Clothes were layered, first a base layer of linen or cotton against the skin, then wool layers for insulation, finally outer layers of leather or furs to block wind. But even with all those layers, the cold found ways to penetrate, seeping through any gap, any area where layers didn't overlap perfectly. Snowstorms in the mountains were as dangerous as sandstorms in the desert, perhaps more so. Visibility dropped to zero. Howling winds made communication impossible. Snow piled up quickly, burying trails, turning familiar landscapes into unrecognizable terrain. Temperatures dropped even further during storms. The only option was to find shelter, a cave, a rock overhang, anything that provided some protection from the elements, and wait. Storms could last days. Supplies were consumed without progress being made. Animals died from cold or starvation. People did too. When storms finally passed, the work of digging through accumulated snow, assessing damage, deciding whether to continue or turn back, began. Avalanches were another constant danger. Snow accumulated on steep slopes was inherently unstable. A loud noise, a vibration, sometimes apparently nothing, could trigger the collapse. Thousands of tons of snow came thundering down the mountain at terrifying speeds, engulfing everything in its path. There was no outrunning an avalanche if you were in its way. A few lucky ones were buried in air pockets and could be rescued if companions acted quickly. Most simply vanished, their bodies not found until the snow melted months later, if at all. Despite all these dangers, the mountains had a wild and majestic beauty that left even seasoned merchants speechless. Snow-capped peaks glowed pink and gold at sunrise and sunset, colors so intense they seemed unreal. Deep valleys where rivers ran were green and fertile during warmer months, dotted with wildflowers in impossible profusion. The air, though thin, was crystalline, allowing visibility of impossible distances. You could see mountains hundreds of kilometers away, their shapes sharp against deep blue skies. At night, stars seemed even brighter than in the desert, so close you felt you could reach them. There were also moments of profound tranquility in the mountains. When the wind stopped and no storm threatened, the silence was absolute in a way rarely found at lower altitudes. No birds sang at these extreme heights. No insects buzzed. Just silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat, your own blood pulsing in your ears. For some, that silence was unsettling, almost oppressive. For others, it was deeply peaceful, an opportunity for contemplation and reflection impossible amid the constant noise of normal life. Mountain passes, the places where trails crossed from one valley to another through low points in the ranges, were crucial milestones in any mountain journey. Reaching the top of a pass meant the hardest part of the ascent was complete, and now came the descent. But descents had their own dangers. Steep trails could be even more treacherous going down than up, easier to lose balance and fall. Animals, sensing the worst was over, sometimes grew careless. Constant vigilance remained essential. Many passes had shrines or religious markers at their highest points, piles of stones where travelers added a stone in gratitude for safe passage, prayer flags fluttering in the wind, carrying blessings to the heavens, small statues or icons of protective deities. Merchants of all faiths made offerings at these places, not wanting to risk offending any powers that might influence their fate. It was a humble acknowledgement that despite all skill and preparation, survival in the mountains ultimately depended on forces beyond human control. Luck, fate, divine will, whatever you chose to call it. Have you ever faced something that tested your physical and mental limits, something that made you question if you could keep going, if it was worth it? The Silk Road Mountains did that to everyone who crossed them, and yet they kept going because turning back meant admitting defeat and losing everything they'd invested. There's remarkable strength in continuing when every fiber of your being wants to stop, when every step is agony, when the goal seems impossible. It's in those moments we discover what we're truly made of, that we transcend our perceived limitations and achieve something greater. The merchants who crossed those mountains weren't superhuman. They were just humans who refused to quit, who put one foot in front of the other even when it seemed impossible, who proved repeatedly that determination can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. After weeks or months crossing deserts and mountains, spotting a city was a transformative experience. First came the signs of civilization, cultivated fields stretching out in organized patterns, irrigation systems channeling water with ingenious precision, herds of domestic animals grazing under the supervision of shepherds. Then, the city walls themselves became visible, massive structures of mud brick or stone rising impressively against the horizon. Fortified gates controlled entry and exit, guarded by soldiers who inspected every arriving caravan, collecting taxes, checking goods, maintaining order. The cities along the Silk Road were unlike anything else in the ancient world. They were true crossroads where east met west, where north mixed with south, where cultures, religions, languages and traditions collided and fused in unique combinations. On a single street, you could see Buddhist temples with their characteristic curved roofs alongside elegant minarets of mosques, Nestorian churches with discreet crosses, Zoroastrian temples where sacred fires burned perpetually, and shrines to local religions that predated all these imports. You could hear dozens of languages spoken simultaneously, see clothing in radically different styles, smell spices and incense from all corners of the known world. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Kashgar, Dunhuang, Balkh. These names echoed through the Silk Road like legends. Each city had its own personality, its own specialties, its own rich history. Samarkand, often called the Pearl of the East, was famous for its magnificent buildings decorated with brilliant blue tiles that seemed to capture the sky itself. Bukhara was known as a center of learning, its madrasas attracting scholars from distant lands. Kashgar, located at the point where routes from China split to go around the Taklamakan Desert to the north or south, was a melting pot of cultures where virtually any imaginable commodity could be found. The markets of these cities were sensory spectacles that defied description. Imagine walking through covered streets where sunlight filtered through straw or fabric roofs, creating dancing patterns of light and shadow. The air was thick with aromas, spicy spices, sweet incense, tanned leather, metals being worked, fresh bread baking, ripe fruits, exotic perfumes. Sounds created a chaotic symphony, vendors shouting to attract customers, buyers haggling prices in voices ranging from conspiratorial whispers to indignant shouts, hammers striking metal, looms clicking rhythmically, musicians playing to entertain and draw crowds, animals making their characteristic noises. Visually, the markets were explosions of color and movement, fabrics in every imaginable color, shining Chinese silks in vibrant reds, deep blues, emerald greens, Indian cottons dyed with indigo and saffron, Persian wools in complex patterns, Egyptian linen of pure whiteness. Carpets hung on display, their intricate patterns representing months or years of skilled weavers' work. Ceramics and porcelains arranged carefully, from simple utilitarian pieces to elaborately decorated works of art. Jewelry glittering under filtered light, gold, silver, precious, and semi-precious stones of every variety. Weapons and armor for those needing protection, swords with characteristic curved blades, ornate daggers, composite bows requiring immense strength to draw, scale or chain mail armor. Specialized sections of the markets dealt with specific goods. The spice bazaar was particularly impressive, with mountains of black pepper, cinnamon sticks, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, saffron. The last so valuable it was sold in tiny quantities and carefully guarded. Spice merchants were experts at detecting quality and adulteration using all their senses, sight to assess color and appearance, touch to feel texture, smell to verify aroma, even taste, touching small amounts to tongues to confirm authenticity. The fabric bazaar displayed rolls upon rolls of materials, vendors unrolling them dramatically to demonstrate quality, light catching fibers and revealing textures. The metal bazaar echoed with the sounds of work, blacksmiths shaping iron into tools and weapons, goldsmiths creating delicate jewelry, coppersmiths hammering complex patterns into trays and vessels. Bargaining was a refined art in these markets, almost a ritualized dance. Initial prices were always absurdly high, expecting buyers to make absurdly low counteroffers. Through rounds of offers and counteroffers, accompanied by dramatic gestures, expressions of shock and insult, invocations of deities as witnesses to how reasonable each side was being, a price was eventually reached that both parties could accept, though both pretended to be dissatisfied, the seller lamenting he was practically giving away the goods, the buyer complaining he was being robbed. This performance was expected and enjoyed. Trying to simply pay the asking price initially would be seen as strange and suspicious. But the Silk Road cities were more than just markets. They were centers of production where artisans created goods that would be traded across continents. Weaving workshops produced fabrics, their looms operated by skilled workers whose fingers flew through threads with speed and precision born of years of practice. Pottery workshops had kilns where pieces were fired at precise temperatures to achieve specific colors and finishes, technical knowledge passed down through generations. Metalworking shops produced everything from practical tools to elaborately decorative objects. Master artisans overseeing apprentices who would learn the craft over years. The cities were also centers of learning and culture. Libraries held precious manuscripts, religious texts, philosophical works, scientific treatises, poetry, history. Scribes copied these texts meticulously by hand, each copy taking weeks or months to complete, preserving knowledge and allowing its dissemination. Madrasas and other educational institutions taught students everything from theology to mathematics, astronomy to medicine. Scholars from different traditions interacted, exchanged ideas, sometimes debated heatedly, contributing to an intellectual flourishing that benefited all involved cultures. Entertainment was abundant in the cities. There were tea houses where men gathered to converse, smoke, play strategy games like chess or Go. There were professional storytellers who recited epics lasting nights, their dramatic performances holding audiences captivated. There were musicians and dancers, acrobats and jugglers, wrestlers and other athletes who performed in public squares or private establishments. There were public baths where people not only washed but socialized, did business, relaxed in steam rooms. The religious diversity of the Silk Road cities was remarkable for the time. Though tensions occasionally arose, there was generally a pragmatic tolerance. Rulers recognized that trade benefited when merchants from all backgrounds felt welcome. Religious communities often lived in their own neighborhoods, maintaining their own traditions, but interacted regularly in the market and other public spaces. Festivals from different religions added variety to the calendar, each with its own celebrations, special foods, music, and rituals. Government structures varied from city to city. Some were ruled by local kings or sultans who maintained substantial autonomy. Others were administered by governors appointed by distant empires, Chinese, Persian, Arab, depending on the era and location. Some were merchant republics where councils of wealthy traders made collective decisions. But regardless of the formal structure, trade was always central. Taxes on passing goods were crucial sources of revenue. Maintaining security on trade routes was a priority. Facilitating trade through infrastructure, caravanserais, markets, standardized systems of weights and measures was an investment that paid off through increased prosperity. For merchants who had spent weeks or months in deserts and mountains, the cities offered luxuries almost forgotten. Elaborate meals with multiple courses instead of simple gruel, comfortable beds instead of hard ground, hot baths where layers of grime could finally be completely removed, clean clothes not impregnated with dust and sweat, conversations with people sharing languages and cultures, news from home, sometimes months outdated but still eagerly received. Letters could be sent and received, maintaining tenuous connections with distant families. But the cities also presented their own dangers. Thieves were more sophisticated than desert bandits, using cunning instead of force. Goods could be stolen from supposedly secure warehouses. Con artists tried to swindle foreign merchants unfamiliar with local customs. Diseases spread more easily in densely populated areas. Epidemics occasionally swept through cities, killing thousands. Political conflicts could make cities dangerous, especially for foreigners who might be viewed with suspicion or blamed for problems they didn't cause. Time spent in cities was used strategically. Goods brought from afar were sold, ideally with substantial profits that justified all the risks and hardships of the journey. New goods were bought to carry further or back home. Information was gathered about market conditions in other cities, alternative routes, political situations that could affect future travels. Connections were established or renewed. Reliable trading partners were valuable assets, relationships that could last decades and benefit both sides repeatedly. Eventually, the time came to depart again. New caravans formed, combining merchants who had arrived separately, but now would travel together for safety and companionship. Supplies were bought, animals acquired or traded, equipment checked and repaired. And then, with a mix of anticipation and apprehension, the city gates were passed once more, civilization left behind, and the journey continued. Think about the cities where you live or visit. Are they cultural crossroads like these ancient cities were? Probably yes, more than you realize. Restaurants serving food from dozens of countries, stores selling products made on every continent, people from diverse backgrounds living side by side. The globalization we take for granted has deep roots in these ancient Silk Road cities, where for the first time in human history, the entire world truly met, traded, learned from each other. We are heirs to that tradition, living in a world those ancient merchants helped create through their courage, ambition, and willingness to cross the unknown in search of connection and profit. If these stories are expanding your perspective on how our modern world was shaped, consider supporting this content. Your active engagement helps keep these narratives alive and reaching more people. Share your thoughts, your reflections on how the past echoes in the present. We're all connected through thousands of years of human history, and recognizing those connections makes us more aware of our place in the grand narrative of humanity. Not all the dangers of the Silk Road came from nature. Humans, with their unique capacity for organized violence and calculated greed, posed threats as significant as any sandstorm or treacherous mountain pass. Bandits were a constant reality, a threat that hung over every caravan, turning every isolated valley and narrow gorge into a potential ambush site. These weren't opportunistic criminals acting alone, but often organized groups, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, operating with near military discipline and sophisticated intelligence about caravan movements. The most dangerous regions were those where central authority was weak or non-existent, border areas between empires, remote mountainous territories where no government exerted effective control, stretches of desert so vast that patrols were impossible. In these lawless places, bandits operated with relative impunity, establishing bases in caves or hidden valleys, maintaining networks of informants who alerted them to approaching caravans, planning attacks with careful strategy that maximized chances of success while minimizing risks to themselves. Methods varied depending on the terrain and the bandits' capabilities. In open deserts, attacks often came at dawn or dusk when low light made it hard to spot attackers approaching till they were dangerously close. Horse-mounted bandits surged out of nowhere, encircling caravans, using speed and surprise as primary weapons. In mountains, ambushes were set up in places where caravans were most vulnerable, narrow trails with no room to maneuver, bridges where the caravan was forced to stretch out in a thin line, passes where rocks could be rolled down from above to block escape. Signs of an impending attack were subtle and often noticed only by experienced guards. Birds, suddenly and inexplicably silent. Dust on the horizon that didn't match wind patterns. Glints of light on metal where nothing should be. Displaced stones on trails that had been solid. Marks in the sand or dirt suggesting recent passage of large groups. Veteran guards developed a sixth sense for danger, an intuition born of years of experience that made them tense and alert even when they couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. When attacks happened, they were chaotic and terrifying. The silence was broken by war cries, the thunder of hooves, the whistle of arrows slicing through the air. Well-organized bandits targeted guards first, trying to neutralize armed resistance quickly. Arrows flew from multiple directions, forcing defenders to take cover instead of firing back effectively. Riders charged with lances or swords, trying to break the caravan's formation and create panic. Animals, frightened by the noise and violence, often thrashed or tried to flee, adding to the chaos. The caravan's response depended on multiple factors: how many guards they had, how well trained and equipped they were, the terrain, the number of attackers, whether there was any chance of escape, or if fighting was the only option. Well-prepared caravans had established plans. Guards formed defensive perimeters around the most valuable goods. Merchants who could fight grabbed weapons. Most carried at least a knife or sword. Some were competent archers. Animals were grouped in the center of the defensive formation as much as possible. Organized shouts tried to maintain communication and coordination amid the chaos. Some caravans chose not to fight, calculating that resistance would result in more deaths, and that bandits were mainly after goods, not massacre. In those cases, quick negotiations happened. How much the bandits would take, what would be left for the caravan to continue. These negotiations were tense, both sides knowing violence could erupt at any moment if terms weren't acceptable. Experienced bandits knew that completely ruining caravans was counterproductive. Future caravans would avoid the route, or governments would be pressured to act. Better to take a substantial portion but leave enough for trade to continue, ensuring future targets. Other caravans fought fiercely, especially if they had numerous and well-armed guards, or if they carried goods so valuable that losing them meant total ruin. These battles could last hours, turning into bloody standoffs where both sides suffered significant casualties. Bandits, facing stronger resistance than expected, sometimes retreated, deciding the risk wasn't worth the reward. Other times, they pressed on, determined not to let a caravan escape and encourage future resistance. The aftermath of bandit attacks varied dramatically. In the best case, the caravan lost a portion of its goods, but everyone survived and could continue, though with severely reduced profits. In the worst case, the caravan was completely destroyed, everyone killed or enslaved, all goods stolen, animals taken, equipment looted. Between those extremes were countless variations. Wounded needed treatment with limited medical resources. Dead needed burial, prayers offered, families eventually notified. Goods damaged in the fight needed assessment. Decisions had to be made about whether to continue or turn back. But bandits weren't the only human threat. There was also official corruption. Border guards or tax collectors demanding fees far beyond what was legally due, knowing foreign merchants had little recourse. Refusing to pay could result in goods being confiscated, caravans delayed indefinitely, or even arrest on fabricated charges. Merchants learned to budget for these extortions, treating them as inevitable costs of doing business, though that didn't make it any less frustrating. There were rivalries between merchant groups that occasionally turned violent. Merchants from different regions or ethnicities sometimes saw each other as competitors to be eliminated rather than colleagues in the same risky business. Sabotage happened, goods secretly damaged, animals poisoned, false information spread about routes or market conditions. In extreme cases, rival caravans attacked each other, disguising their assaults as bandit work. There was also the danger of wars and political conflicts. The Silk Road crossed territories of multiple empires and kingdoms that were often at odds. Armies on campaign didn't make careful distinctions between neutral caravans and enemy supplies. Both could be confiscated. Regions that were safe when a caravan departed could be at war by the time it arrived. Borders could close without warning. Merchants could find themselves trapped in besieged cities, their goods useless, their lives in danger. Slavery was another horrific threat. Bandits who captured caravan members often sold them as slaves rather than simply killing them. Strong young men who could work, artisans with valuable skills, even children, all had value in the slave markets that existed in many regions along the Silk Road. Being captured and enslaved meant losing not just goods and profits, but freedom, identity, any hope of returning home. A few lucky ones were eventually ransomed by families or merchant associations. Most disappeared into slavery, their previous lives becoming distant memories. The response to these human threats was multifaceted. Caravans invested heavily in security, hiring more guards, buying better weapons and armor, training to work coordinately in case of attack. Routes were chosen not just for efficiency but for relative safety, even if that meant longer journeys. Timing was considered. Traveling when other caravans were also on the route provided safety in numbers, and bandits were less likely to attack when targets were harder. Relationships were cultivated with local authorities who could provide protection, or at least warning of dangers. There were also attempts to deal with bandits in less confrontational ways. Some bandit groups were essentially extortionists who allowed safe passage for regular payments, protection rackets before the term existed. Merchants who traveled routes regularly sometimes established arrangements with these groups, paying what was effectively an unofficial tax, but getting assurance they wouldn't be attacked. It was morally questionable and economically costly, but often cheaper than the alternatives. Governments along the Silk Road had an interest in controlling banditry, since safe trade generated tax revenue. Military campaigns were periodically launched against known bandit groups. Watchtowers were built at strategic spots, garrisoned by soldiers who could signal warnings of danger. Patrols roamed main routes, but the territories were vast, resources limited, and bandits adaptable, shifting locations and tactics as needed. It was a cat-and-mouse game with no definitive winner. For individual merchants, the threat of human violence was perhaps more psychologically draining than natural dangers. Storms and mountains were impersonal, indifferent, but bandits were humans making conscious choices to harm other humans for gain. There was something particularly disturbing about knowing other humans were actively planning to rob, injure, or kill you. It created an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that was emotionally exhausting to maintain for months of travel. And yet, despite all these dangers, trade continued. Merchants developed resilience, learned to manage fear, found courage to press on even after traumatic experiences. Those who survived attacks and completed their journeys had stories to tell that earned respect and admiration. Scars became badges of honor, evidence they'd faced the worst the Silk Road could offer and survived. There was pride in that, a sense of having been tested and not found wanting. You've probably never had to defend your possessions with violence, never faced the real possibility of being attacked by bandits just trying to do your job. The security you enjoy, being able to travel without constant fear of violence, trusting authorities will protect you, knowing laws exist and are generally enforced, is a modern luxury that would be incomprehensible to Silk Road merchants. They lived in a far more dangerous world where violence was always a possibility, where protection depended on personal or hired strength, where justice was often a matter of power rather than principle. And yet they persisted, proving humans can adapt to extraordinarily difficult circumstances and not just survive, but occasionally thrive. If the visible dangers of the Silk Road, deserts, mountains, bandits, were terrifying, the invisible dangers were perhaps even more frightening. Diseases traveled alongside the caravans, silent passengers that respected no borders, that couldn't be fought with swords or avoided through alternative routes. In an era before germ theory, before antibiotics, before even basic understanding of how diseases spread, falling ill on a caravan was often a death sentence, and the conditions of road life, chronic malnutrition, extreme physical exhaustion, exposure to the elements, lack of proper hygiene, forced proximity with others in confined spaces, created perfect environments for diseases to thrive. The diseases that afflicted Silk Road travelers were varied and devastating. Gastrointestinal illnesses were perhaps the most common: dysentery, cholera, typhoid fever, caused by contaminated water or spoiled food. The symptoms were miserable: severe diarrhea that dehydrated rapidly, vomiting that made it impossible to keep down any nutrition, abdominal cramps that doubled strong men in agony. In normal conditions, these diseases were serious. On the road, where clean water was scarce and proper rest impossible, they were often fatal. Bodies already weakened by months of travel simply had no reserves to fight aggressive infections. Respiratory diseases were another major category of affliction. Pneumonia developed easily when exhausted men slept in damp clothes after rain or snow, when cold mountain air was inhaled deeply during physical exertion, when weakened immune systems couldn't combat bacterial or viral infections. Tuberculosis, that slow killer, was endemic in many regions, spreading easily in crowded caravanserais where people slept in close proximity. A cough that started as a minor annoyance progressed to something far more sinister: coughing up blood, burning fever, progressive weakness that eventually made continuing to travel impossible. If you're discovering aspects of history you never imagined that are changing how you see the modern world, leave a comment sharing which part has surprised you most so far. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing so. Every person who joins this community motivates us to keep bringing these fascinating stories that connect past and present. Wounds that would heal without complication in clean environments became portals to fatal infections on the road. A simple cut, a burst blister, a thorn scratch, any break in the skin could get infected. Without antibiotics, infections progressed quickly. The area around the wound became red, swollen, hot to the touch. Pus formed, sometimes in alarming quantities. Red streaks extended from the wound, sign that the infection was spreading through the lymphatic system. Fever developed as the body tried to fight the bacterial invasion. If the infection reached the bloodstream, sepsis set in, and death often followed in days. Gangrene was particularly dreaded. Frozen fingers or toes in the mountains, wounds not cleaned properly, broken bones piercing skin, any of these could lead to dying tissue. The flesh turned black, the smell was unmistakable and nauseating, and the only solution was amputation. Without proper anesthesia, without sterilized surgical instruments, without antibiotics to prevent post-operative infection, roadside amputations were brutal procedures with low survival rates. Men were held down while they screamed, limbs sawn off with tools designed for wood, not flesh, wounds cauterized with hot irons to stop bleeding. Those who survived were maimed, their lives and careers as merchants often ended. Vector-borne diseases added another layer of danger. Malaria, transmitted by mosquitoes, was prevalent in many wetter regions along the Silk Road. The characteristic cycles of fever, violent chills followed by burning fever followed by profuse sweats, repeated with predictable regularity, progressively debilitating victims. Without quinine or modern treatments, chronic malaria could last years, gradually weakening people. Bubonic plague, transmitted by rat fleas, was the most feared of all. When outbreaks occurred, entire cities could be devastated. Caravans arriving from infected areas were sometimes denied entry to cities, forced to camp outside walls until it was clear they didn't carry the disease. Treatments available were limited and based on medical understandings that were, by modern standards, fundamentally incorrect. Humoral theory, the idea that health depended on balance among four bodily humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, dominated medical thinking in many cultures. Treatments aimed to restore balance through methods that often did more harm than good. Bloodletting, where blood was deliberately removed from the body through cuts or leeches, was a common treatment for fever and many other conditions, based on the belief that excess blood caused problems. In reality, removing blood from people already weakened by illness simply weakened them further. Purgatives and emetics, substances that caused diarrhea or vomiting, were used extensively, based on the idea that expelling substances from the body would help cleanse what was causing the disease. For someone already suffering from gastrointestinal illness, these treatments were counterproductive, accelerating fatal dehydration. But without understanding of microbiology, without the ability to see bacteria or viruses, physicians worked with the theories they had, doing the best they could with limited knowledge. Not all treatments were useless. Herbal remedies, developed through centuries of trial and error, sometimes contained compounds that really helped. Willow bark, used for pain and fever, contains salicin, a chemical precursor to aspirin. Opium, derived from poppies, was a powerful analgesic that at least provided relief from suffering even when it didn't cure the underlying condition. Garlic, used to prevent infection, has genuine antimicrobial properties. Honey applied to wounds has antibacterial qualities. Many traditional remedies, though not scientifically understood at the time, had real efficacy. Healers traveled with some caravans, individuals who had studied traditional medicine from their cultures and accumulated experience treating the common ailments of the road. These healers were invaluable. their skills often meaning the difference between life and death. They knew which herbs to look for in different regions, how to prepare potions and ointments, how to immobilize broken bones, how to stitch wounds, how to recognize signs of specific diseases and apply appropriate treatments. Their knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship, young people studying with masters for years before being considered competent. Prevention, though not understood in modern terms, was practiced instinctively. Water from unknown sources was boiled when possible, killing pathogens without anyone knowing pathogens existed. Food was cooked thoroughly, again killing disease-causing organisms. Sick people were sometimes isolated from the rest of the caravan, reducing transmission even if the mechanism wasn't understood. Clothes and blankets were washed when opportunity arose, removing parasites and reducing pathogen load. But even with these precautions, diseases were inevitable. When someone fell seriously ill, hard decisions had to be made. If the person could travel even slowly, the caravan usually continued, unable to afford indefinite stops. If the person was too sick to move, the caravan faced an agonizing choice: leaving the person behind, perhaps with some supplies, and hope they'd recover, or that another caravan would find them, was sometimes the only practical option. Family or close friends sometimes stayed behind voluntarily, sacrificing their own journeys to care for loved ones, knowing they'd probably never catch the original caravan. Death was a frequent companion on caravans. When someone died, rituals appropriate to their religion were performed as circumstances allowed. Bodies were buried when the soil permitted, marked with piled stones or simple wooden markers. In deserts or frozen mountains where digging was impossible, bodies were sometimes covered with rocks or left to the elements, with prayers offered, asking forgiveness for the lack of proper burial. Personal belongings were usually kept to be eventually delivered to families, though that wasn't always possible. The psychological impact of witnessing repeated death was profound. Men who started journeys optimistic and full of life became grim and fatalistic after seeing companions die from diseases that couldn't be prevented or cured. Some developed what we'd recognize today as trauma or depression, becoming withdrawn, losing interest in everything, sometimes simply giving up the fight for survival. Others developed emotional hardness, a capacity to witness suffering without being deeply affected, a necessary defense mechanism to keep functioning in such a brutal environment. Superstitions and religious practices flourished in response to the felt helplessness in the face of disease. Amulets were worn to ward off illness. Prayers were offered constantly. Sacrifices were made to deities believed to control health and disease. When someone recovered from serious illness, it was attributed to divine intervention, and promises made during sickness, donations to temples, pilgrimages, changes in behavior, were faithfully kept. When someone died, it was sometimes interpreted as punishment for sins or as the inscrutable will of higher powers. The Silk Road also served as a vector for pandemics that shaped history. The 14th century Black Death, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, traveled along Asian trade routes to the Mediterranean. Other diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, spread similarly, each finding populations without immunity and causing devastation. The trade that brought wealth and cultural connection also brought death on scales hard to comprehend today. For merchants who survived their journeys without falling seriously ill, there was deep gratitude and often a sense they'd been protected by forces beyond themselves. Those who completed multiple journeys without serious illness were considered lucky or blessed. And those who fell ill but recovered often felt they'd been given a second chance, an opportunity to live they shouldn't waste. Think about how you react to a common cold today. You take medications that relieve symptoms, perhaps antibiotics if it's bacterial, rest in a comfortable home with entertainment at hand, and generally recover fully in days. For Silk Road merchants, even minor illnesses could become serious, and serious diseases were often fatal. The modern medicine you take for granted antibiotics, antivirals, effective painkillers, sterile surgery, understanding of how diseases spread and how to prevent them would have seemed miraculous to them. Every pill you casually take represents centuries of scientific progress, countless lives lost in the process of learning to combat disease. It's a gift we rarely acknowledge until we need it. The Silk Road was an unparalleled linguistic melting pot in ancient history, a place where dozens of languages collided, mixed, and sometimes fused into hybrid forms that existed only along the trade routes. A merchant traveling from Chang'an in China to Constantinople in the Mediterranean would cross territories where Chinese, Sogdian, Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Greek, and countless other languages were spoken. The ability to communicate across these linguistic barriers wasn't just convenient, it was absolutely essential for survival and success. Without communication, there was no negotiation. Without negotiation, there was no trade. And without trade, the entire structure of the Silk Road would collapse. Communication challenges started at the most basic level. Alphabets were radically different. Chinese characters shared nothing with Arabic script, which in turn was completely unlike Greek or Latin alphabets. Grammatical structures varied enormously. Some languages read left to right, others right to left, traditional Chinese top to bottom. Sounds that existed in one language could be completely absent in another, making even pronunciation of proper names problematic. Concepts central to one culture might have no direct equivalents in other languages, requiring elaborate explanations or simply remaining misunderstood. Interpreters were therefore crucial figures along the Silk Road, linguistic intermediaries without whom intercultural trade would be impossible. The best interpreters were extraordinary polyglots, fluent in 3, 4, sometimes 5 or more languages. They didn't just translate words, but served as cultural mediators, explaining customs, interpreting gestures, navigating the subtleties of etiquette that varied dramatically between cultures. A skilled interpreter could make the difference between a successful negotiation and an accidental insult that ruined business relationships. The Sogdians that Central Asian people mentioned earlier were particularly renowned as interpreters and linguistic go-betweens. Their geographic position at the heart of the Silk Road, combined with their mercantile culture, meant that learning multiple languages wasn't just advantageous, but necessary. Sogdian children grew up hearing Chinese, Turkish, Persian, and their own Sogdian language, absorbing multiple linguistic systems naturally. Adult Sogdians often mastered additional languages through years of travel and trade. They became indispensable as middlemen, establishing communities in cities along the entire length of the Silk Road, serving as linguistic and cultural bridges. But not everyone could afford professional interpreters, and even with interpreters, there were situations where direct communication was necessary. This led to the development of lingua francas, simplified languages that served as common means of communication between people who didn't share a native tongue. Along different sections of the Silk Road, different languages served this function. Sogdian was a lingua franca in parts of Central Asia for centuries. Persian played a similar role in regions further west. Simplified forms of Chinese were used in border areas. These lingua francas were generally reduced versions of the original languages, with simplified grammar and vocabulary focused on essential trade terms. In addition to spoken languages, non-verbal communication systems developed. Hand gestures became a language in their own right, especially for price negotiation. Merchants developed elaborate systems where fingers indicated numbers, where touching different parts of the hand or arm meant different values or types of goods. These gestural negotiations could happen silently, sometimes hidden under fabrics, so other merchants couldn't see the terms being discussed, allowing private deals even in crowded markets. Facial expressions and body language were read carefully, though with awareness that meanings could vary between cultures. A gesture respectful in one culture could be offensive in another. Direct eye contact was valued in some societies as a sign of honesty, but considered rude or challenging in others. Experienced merchants learned to read these differences, adapting their own non-verbal behavior to match the cultural expectations of whoever they were negotiating with. Written documents presented their own challenges. Contracts and agreements needed to be comprehensible to both parties, but when the parties used completely different writing systems, that was problematic. Solutions included bilingual or multilingual documents, where the same text was written in multiple languages side by side. Scribes specialized in multiple scripts were valuable for creating these documents. Seals and personal marks served as signatures, recognizable regardless of language, providing authentication that transcended linguistic barriers. Numbers were an area where communication across cultures was relatively easier. Though numerical systems varied, Chinese, Roman, Arabic, and others, the concept of quantity was universal. Fingers could show small numbers universally. For larger numbers, physical objects could be used: stones, sticks, beads on abacuses. Merchants developed fluency in multiple numerical systems, able to calculate in whatever system their trading partners used. Weights and measures were more problematic. Each region had its own standards, and these varied not just in units, but sometimes in basic definitions. What constituted a foot in length differed between cultures. Weights nominally similar could differ substantially. This created opportunities for dishonesty, sellers using lighter weights than standard when selling, heavier when buying. Experienced merchants carried their own sets of weights and measures, insisting on checking goods using instruments they trusted. Disputes over measurements were common and could become heated when large quantities and values were involved. Currencies presented similar challenges. Hundreds of different types of coins circulated along the Silk Road, issued by different rulers, varying in metal purity and weight. Merchants needed to be experts at appraising coins, testing weight, biting to check hardness, using touchstones to assess gold or silver purity. Exchange rates fluctuated based on supply and demand, metal purity, and trust in different issuing authorities. Specialized money changers operated in major cities, but their rates often included substantial margins. Many merchants preferred dealing in weighed precious metals directly, avoiding complications of multiple currencies. Linguistic misunderstandings could have serious consequences. A misinterpreted word during negotiation could result in agreements one party thought meant one thing and the other something completely different. When these discrepancies were discovered, disputes arose over what terms had actually been agreed upon. Without clear written records in a language both parties fully understood, resolving these disputes was difficult. Reputation and witnesses became crucial. Other merchants who had witnessed the negotiation could be called to testify about what they'd understood to be agreed. Humor and nuances were particularly hard to convey across linguistic barriers. Jokes rarely translated well, often depending on puns or cultural references that made no sense in other languages. Sarcasm and irony could be completely misinterpreted, leading to unintended offenses. Merchants learned to be direct in business communication, avoiding subtleties that could be lost in translation, reserving humor for interactions with those who shared language and culture. Proper names were a constant source of confusion. Naming systems varied between cultures. Some used a single name, others name and patronymic, others complex family names. Pronunciation of foreign names was often impossible for speakers of other languages, leading to approximations that could be unrecognizable to the person being named. Some merchants adopted trade names that were more easily pronounceable in multiple languages, using these professionally while keeping their true names for personal and family use. Religious and philosophical concepts were particularly challenging to communicate across cultures. When Buddhism spread from India to China along the Silk Road, translators struggled to find Chinese equivalents for Buddhist concepts with no direct parallels. Taoist terms were sometimes adapted to express Buddhist ideas, creating fusions that were neither purely Buddhist nor purely Taoist. Similar adaptation happened when other religions, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, spread along the routes, each shaped by the languages and cultures they encountered. Language learning was a valuable investment for serious merchants. Those who mastered multiple languages had huge advantages. They could negotiate directly without intermediaries, reducing costs and misunderstandings. They could build deeper relationships with trading partners. They could access information not translated. Young people from merchant families were often sent to live in foreign regions, specifically to learn languages, returning years later as valuable assets to family businesses. But language learning was challenging without modern resources. There were no comprehensive dictionaries, no structured courses, no audio recordings to practice pronunciation. Learning happened through immersion, living among native speakers, making embarrassing mistakes, gradually absorbing vocabulary and grammar through repeated exposure. Some had a natural talent for languages, picking up new ones quickly. Others struggled for years to achieve even basic fluency. Writing was an even more specialized skill than speaking. Many merchants were functionally illiterate, able to speak several languages but unable to read or write any of them. They relied on scribes to create documents, on memorization, to keep transaction records, on witnesses to verify agreements. Those who were literate, especially in multiple languages, had significant professional advantages and often commanded greater respect and compensation. The linguistic diversity of the Silk Road also facilitated intellectual exchange. Texts were translated between languages, carrying scientific, philosophical, and literary ideas across cultures. Indian mathematics traveled to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. Greek astronomy influenced scientific thought in Persia and beyond. Medical texts circulated in multiple languages, each translation sometimes adding commentaries and observations from local physicians. This intellectual exchange, facilitated by dedicated translators, contributed to advances in multiple fields that benefited all of humanity. Think about how you communicate today. Automatic translators on phones can translate instantly between dozens of languages. Apps teach new languages through structured lessons. Online dictionaries provide translations and pronunciations with a click. You can travel to countries where you don't speak the language and still get by reasonably well. For Silk Road merchants, every conversation across linguistic barriers was hard work. Every misunderstanding could be costly. Every new language learned represented years of dedicated effort. And yet they managed to create a trade network spanning continents, proving humans can find ways to communicate and cooperate, even when languages and cultures are radically different. That's a lesson that remains relevant today, when our globalized world demands constant communication across cultural and linguistic differences. No discussion of the Silk Road would be complete without recognizing the true silent heroes of these epic journeys, the animals that carried goods, people, and hopes across thousands of kilometers of unforgiving terrain. Horses, camels, mules, yaks, donkeys. Each of these animals played crucial roles, their unique capabilities making possible what would otherwise be impossible. Without them, the Silk Road simply couldn't have existed. Humans alone couldn't carry enough loads to make long-distance trade profitable, couldn't cross deserts or mountains with the necessary speed, couldn't survive the extreme conditions without the assistance of these extraordinary animal companions. The Bactrian camel with its two humps was undoubtedly the most iconic animal of the Silk Road. These magnificent creatures adapted over millennia to survive in Central Asia's harshest deserts, were marvels of evolutionary engineering. Their humps, contrary to popular belief, didn't store water but fat, energy reserves that could be metabolized when food was scarce. But their true genius lay in their extraordinary ability to conserve water efficiently. Camels could go days, sometimes weeks, without drinking, their bodies minimizing water loss through highly concentrated urine and dry feces, their ability to tolerate dehydration that would kill other mammals, and their skill at drinking enormous quantities quickly when water was finally available, up to 150 liters in minutes. Their physical adaptations for desert life were equally impressive. Nostrils that could close completely during sandstorms, preventing sand from entering lungs. Double and thick eyelashes that protected eyes from wind-blown sand. Broad and padded feet that distributed weight, preventing sinking into loose sand where horses would struggle. Thick fur that provided insulation against both daytime heat and extreme nighttime cold. And temperament, well, temperament was another matter. Camels were notoriously stubborn, temperamental, and prone to spitting on their handlers when irritated. But those who worked with them regularly developed understanding and even affection for these difficult but indispensable creatures. Horses represented speed and status. While camels were practical pack animals, horses were for those who could afford better and needed to travel faster. Specific breeds were particularly prized. Arabian horses with their legendary endurance and elegant beauty, Persian horses known for strength and speed, Central Asian horses adapted to local conditions. The horse trade was, in itself, a significant component of the Silk Road economy. China, in particular, had an insatiable appetite for foreign-bred horses, especially for military use. Chinese dynasties paid fortunes for quality horses, sometimes trading silk worth dozens of horses for a single, exceptional stallion of proven lineage. While you're discovering these fascinating stories about how the ancient world really worked, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapters of this journey. And in the comments, tell us, did you ever imagine animals were so crucial to the ancient global economy? Your participation keeps this community alive and growing. Mules and donkeys were the practical and reliable workhorses of the Silk Road. Hybrids of horses and donkeys, mules, combined the strength of horses with the endurance and sure-footedness of donkeys. They were less temperamental than camels, more resilient than horses, able to navigate treacherous mountainous terrain with a sureness horses couldn't match. Their hooves were tougher, less prone to the problems that plagued horses. They ate less, complained less, and worked consistently. They weren't glamorous, but they were dependable, a quality pragmatic merchants valued above almost anything. Yaks reigned supreme in the extreme altitudes of Central Asia's mountains. These massive bovines covered in long and thick fur that made them look even larger than they already were unique in their ability to function at altitudes where thin air left other animals gasping and useless. Their lungs and hearts were proportionally larger, their blood carried oxygen more efficiently, their bodies had adapted over generations to thrive where others merely survived. In addition to serving as pack animals, yaks provided milk, meat, leather, and even their dung was valuable as fuel in regions where wood was non-existent. Caring for these animals was constant and crucial work. Specialized handlers, men who had spent their lives working with specific types of animals, were essential members of any caravan. They knew each animal individually, their personalities, their quirks, their strengths and weaknesses. They knew when an animal was starting to get sick before obvious symptoms appeared, recognizing subtle changes in behavior or appearance. They knew exactly how much weight each animal could carry without being overloaded, how to distribute loads for ideal balance, how to secure loads so they stayed safe but didn't cause sores. Feeding and watering animals on the journey was a constant logistical challenge. In regions where grazing was available, animals could forage, but in deserts or high mountains, fodder had to be carried, hay, grains, anything that provided nutrition. This meant that part of the caravan's carrying capacity was dedicated to feeding the very animals that carried the goods, a circular calculation that needed careful balancing. Water for animals was an even greater consideration. A camel could go days without drinking but eventually needed enormous quantities. Caravans planned routes meticulously to ensure regular access to enough water for entire herds of animals. Injuries and illnesses in animals were potential disasters. A lame animal couldn't carry a load, reducing the caravan's capacity or forcing redistribution of weight to other already loaded animals. Diseases could spread through herds quickly. Traditional veterinarians traveled with larger caravans, knowing treatments for common ailments, ointments for wounds, poultices for swelling, herbal infusions for digestive problems. But treatments were limited, and seriously injured or ill animals often had to be left behind or culled, their loads transferred, their value lost. The relationship between humans and pack animals was complex. It wasn't simply utilitarian, though utility was certainly central. Handlers who spent months traveling with the same animals developed genuine bonds. They gave names to the animals, talked to them, celebrated when they behaved well, mourned when they died. There was recognition that humans and animals were in this journey together, that one's survival depended on the other. Animals that served faithfully for years, completing multiple journeys, were sometimes retired rather than worked to death, allowed to graze peacefully their final years as reward for service. But there was also cruelty, inevitable in a system where animals were primarily economic assets. Animals were sometimes overloaded when merchants prioritized profit over animal welfare. They were pushed beyond endurance limits when caravans were delayed or desperate. They were sold or abandoned without sentiment when no longer useful. The life of a pack animal on the Silk Road was hard, and many died young, their bodies left along the routes as silent reminders of the cost of trade. Think about the vehicles and transportation systems you use today: cars, trains, planes, ships, all mechanical, all predictable, all maintained through standardized processes. For Silk Road merchants, transportation depended on living creatures with needs, emotions, and wills of their own. You couldn't just fuel a camel like you fuel a car. You had to understand the animal, work with its nature, respect its limitations. It was relationship, not just tool. And perhaps there's something we've lost in this transition to mechanical transport, a connection with the living beings that made journeys possible, a recognition that travel was partnership between humans and animals, not just humans commanding machines. After months or even years on the road, the moment of returning home finally arrived. For some merchants, this meant completing a full circuit, returning to the same cities from which they'd departed, with goods sold and profits, hopefully, realized. For others, it meant settling in new lands, their Silk Road journeys turning into permanent migrations. But for those who returned, the journey back was simultaneously familiar and strange, traversing the same routes but in the opposite direction, seeing the same landscapes but with eyes transformed by experience. The decision of when to return was both strategic and emotional. Strategically, merchants needed to consider whether they'd achieved their commercial goals, whether goods had been sold with sufficient profit, whether new goods to carry back were available at favorable prices, whether market conditions at home favored returning now or if waiting would be more profitable. Emotionally, there was the magnetic pull of home, families unseen for so long, communities left behind, the familiarity and comfort of known places. These considerations competed with temptations to continue, to explore further, to seek additional opportunities before returning. Preparation for the return journey mirrored the original preparation, but with significant differences. Merchants now had experience they hadn't before. They knew the challenges, knew what to expect, had developed skills and resilience through trial. But they were also tired in ways they weren't at the beginning, their bodies marked by months of hardship, their minds carrying memories of dangers faced and companions lost. Animals that had survived the outbound journey were older, more worn, some needing to be replaced by fresh ones bought in local markets. The goods carried back were often different from those taken on the outbound journey. Chinese merchants who had taken silk west returned with Roman glass, Persian horses, Central Asian gemstones. Persian merchants who had taken carpets and worked metals east returned with silk, porcelain, spices. This bi-directional exchange was what made the Silk Road truly a trade route rather than simply one-way export. Each region had specialties valued in other regions, creating complementary flows of goods that benefited all participants. The return journey presented its own psychological challenges. The anticipation that had driven the outbound journey, the excitement of the unknown, the hope of fortune, was replaced by something different. There was relief at finally heading home, but also anxiety about what they'd find. Would families be well? Would businesses have survived in their absence? How would they be received? Would there be recognition of their accomplishments or indifference? These questions weighed on minds as kilometers were consumed. Passing again through places that had been landmarks on the outbound journey evoked powerful memories. The oasis where they'd rested for days, regaining strength. The mountain pass where a snowstorm nearly killed them. The city where they'd made their first big sale. Each place was a layer of memory over geography, transforming physical landscape into emotional landscape. Some places evoked joy, memories of successes, of moments of beauty or camaraderie. Others evoked sadness or trauma, places where companions had died, where attacks had happened, where illnesses had struck. Return caravans often had different compositions from the originals. Some members had died or been left behind. New members had joined, merchants met along the way, workers hired in distant cities, occasionally even entire families who'd decided to migrate. These mixed caravans were microcosms of the Silk Road's diversity, temporary groups united by shared direction but representing vastly different origins. As they approached home, signs of familiarity increased gradually. Landscapes became recognizable, languages heard in villages and towns were those of childhood, foods in markets were those they'd grown up eating. Faces started to look familiar. Not specific people yet, but physical types, styles of dress, ways of moving and interacting that were characteristic of home regions. Each sign of familiarity brought comfort mixed with strangeness. After so much time immersed in foreign cultures, even the familiar seemed slightly alien. Final arrivals were intensely emotional events. Families who'd waited anxiously, never certain if their loved ones would return, exploded in celebration when caravans finally appeared. There were tears, hugs, questions fired so rapidly they couldn't be answered adequately. Children who'd been babies when parents left were now toddlers who didn't recognize the strangers claiming to be their parents. Wives had aged, as had the merchants, both marked by time and separation. Parents who'd been robust when children departed were now frail, or had passed away in the absence, news of death arriving months after the fact. Reintegration into normal life after months or years on the Silk Road was surprisingly difficult. Merchants had grown accustomed to constant movement, to daily challenges, to a life where every day brought something new. Sedentary life seemed strangely monotonous by comparison. They'd developed skills and knowledge with no use in normal domestic life. They'd seen wonders and horrors that those who'd never traveled couldn't truly comprehend. This created distance, a sense of no longer fully belonging to the place they'd called home. The stories they brought were received with fascination mixed with skepticism. Descriptions of magnificent cities, of mountains that touched the sky, of deserts stretching beyond the horizon, of people with radically different appearances and customs. All this seemed too fantastical to be true for those who'd never left their own regions. Merchants learned to temper their stories, to make them more palatable for skeptical audiences, sometimes frustrating themselves with the impossibility of truly conveying what they'd experienced. Profits, when there were profits, transformed lives. Successful merchants returned rich enough to buy properties, establish businesses, secure their families' futures. They became respected figures in communities, their opinions valued, their experiences considered wisdom. Some used their wealth to finance additional journeys, addicted to the thrill and profit potential of long-distance trade. Others retired from active trading, using accumulated capital to invest in local ventures or simply live comfortably. But not all returned rich. Some had lost everything: goods stolen by bandits, destroyed by natural disasters, or simply not finding buyers at prices covering costs. These failed merchants returned in debt, facing years of work to pay creditors, their epic journeys resulting in nothing but hardship and bitter memories. Some never recovered financially, their families ruined by commercial gambles that didn't pay off. And there were those who never returned at all. Dead in deserts or mountains, victims of disease or violence, their fates sometimes known through survivors who brought news, other times remaining mysteries. Families waited years, hope gradually giving way to acceptance that their loved ones would never come back. Widows remarried, businesses were dissolved or taken over by others, lives continued without those who'd left and vanished into the vastness of the Silk Road. For those who completed journeys and returned, there was a deep sense of accomplishment mixed with irreversible transformation. They weren't the same people who'd departed. They'd seen too much, experienced too much, survived too much. They carried within them knowledge of how vast the world was, how diverse the ways of living, how small their home place was in the grand scheme of things. This expanded perspective was gift and burden. Gift because it enriched understanding, burden because it created distance from those who didn't share it. Have you ever returned from a long trip and felt that home seemed different, even though nothing had really changed? You were the one who'd changed, transformed by experiences those at home didn't share. For Silk Road merchants, that feeling was amplified 1,000 times. They'd crossed worlds, literally, and returned fundamentally altered. Their physical journeys were also journeys of personal transformation, trials that tested and revealed character, that expanded horizons in ways that could never be fully reversed. And in that transformation, in that expansion of perspective, through encounter with the different, there's something profoundly relevant to our modern world, where travel is easy, but true openness to other cultures still requires conscious effort. The Silk Road, in its classical form, eventually declined. Maritime routes became more efficient and safe. Empires that had maintained security along the land routes collapsed. Climate changes made some regions less habitable, and political shifts redirected trade flows. By the 15th century, the great era of the Silk Road had essentially ended, though smaller-scale trade continued along some routes. But the impact of these ancient routes resonates through the centuries to today, shaping our modern world in ways we rarely fully recognize. The most obvious legacy is economic. The Silk Road established precedents for long-distance international trade that we still follow. The idea that goods can and should flow across borders, that regional specialization creates opportunities for mutually beneficial exchange, that middlemen play valuable roles connecting producers and consumers. All these concepts were refined along the Silk Road. The credit systems that allowed merchants to finance expensive journeys, the networks of trust that made trade possible across vast distances, the dispute resolution mechanisms that maintained order without strong central authority, all have parallels in modern trade systems. Culturally, the Silk Road facilitated exchanges that transformed civilizations. Religions spread along these routes: Buddhism from India to China and beyond, Islam from Arabia through Central Asia, Nestorian Christianity to the East. Each religion was transformed by the cultures it encountered, creating regional variations that still exist. Chinese Buddhism is different from Indian Buddhism, shaped by encounters with Confucian and Taoist philosophies. Islam in Central Asia developed distinct characteristics influenced by pre-Islamic local traditions. These religious and cultural fusions created a wealth of diversity that defines many regions to this day. While we explore how the past shaped our present, your participation keeps these stories alive. If you're learning something valuable, consider subscribing and sharing in the comments which aspect of the Silk Road surprised you most. We're building a community of curious people who value understanding where we came from to comprehend where we're going. Technologies and knowledge traveled alongside goods. Paper, invented in China, reached the Islamic world and eventually Europe via the Silk Road, revolutionizing communication and knowledge preservation. Gunpowder followed a similar path, transforming warfare globally. Silk-making techniques, though jealously guarded by China for centuries, eventually leaked out, allowing silk production in other regions. Mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge circulated in multiple directions, each culture contributing and benefiting. The algebra you learned in school has roots in Persian and Arab mathematicians who were influenced by Indian and Greek mathematics, all these traditions meeting and merging along the Silk Road. Foods we consider staples today traveled along these ancient routes. Noodles may have origins both Chinese and Italian, but they certainly traveled between East and West. Spices that transformed European cuisines came via the Silk Road before direct maritime routes were established. Fruits and vegetables were introduced to new regions where they thrived and became part of local cuisines. Culinary techniques also traveled, influencing how people prepared and consumed food. Linguistically, the Silk Road left its mark. Words were borrowed between languages as concepts and objects traveled. Many European words for Eastern goods have origins in Persian, Arabic, or Turkic languages, reflecting the routes through which those goods arrived. Patterns of linguistic borrowing map ancient trade routes, providing evidence of historical connections. Even today, linguists can trace the movement of words across cultures, revealing networks of contact and exchange. Genetically, the Silk Road left a legacy in human populations. Migrations along these routes, marriages between people of different origins, and population movements created genetic diversity that modern DNA studies can detect. Populations along the ancient routes often show a mixture of ancestries that reflects centuries of movement and exchange. We are literally products of these ancient connections, carrying in our genes evidence that our ancestors traveled, traded, and mixed across vast distances. Artistically, influences flowed in multiple directions. Chinese artistic styles influenced Persian art and vice versa. Decorative motifs traveled, appearing in modified forms in regions distant from their origins. Musical instruments were adopted and adapted by new cultures. Techniques of ceramics, metalworking, weaving, and other arts were shared and refined. Museums today display objects that clearly show fusions of styles from multiple cultures, physical testimonies to artistic exchange along the Silk Road. Politically, the Silk Road demonstrated that international cooperation, even between very different political entities, was possible when there was mutual benefit. Empires that were rivals in other areas often cooperated to maintain trade route security, recognizing that trade benefited all. Treaties and agreements facilitated merchant movement across borders. Systems of passports and travel documentation have precursors in the documents Silk Road merchants carried. The idea that nations should facilitate international trade, not obstruct it, has roots in these ancient practices. Geographically, the Silk Road expanded human knowledge of the world. Maps improved as travelers returned with information about distant lands. Knowledge of geography, climate, and resources of vast regions was accumulated and shared. This expanded geographic knowledge eventually contributed to the European age of exploration, when navigators sought sea routes to lands they knew about through accounts of land travelers. Philosophically, encounters with radically different cultures forced people to question assumptions about how life should be lived. When you discover that people on the other side of the world have completely different customs but functional societies, it challenges notions that your own culture has the only right way to do things. This cultural relativism, though not universal, planted seeds of thought that eventually flowered into more cosmopolitan and tolerant philosophies. The idea that cultural diversity is a resource, not a problem, has roots in these ancient exchanges. Infrastructure-wise, some of the structures built to facilitate trade on the Silk Road still exist. Ruined caravanserais dot the landscapes of Central Asia and the Middle East, silent reminders of when these regions were centers of global trade. Some cities that thrived as Silk Road hubs are still important today, though for different reasons. Physical routes established by ancient caravans were sometimes followed by modern roads and even railroads, demonstrating that the fundamental geography that made certain routes logical for caravans still makes them logical for modern transport. Educationally, studying the Silk Road offers lessons about globalization, cultural exchange, and interdependence that are extremely relevant today. We live in a globalized world where goods, ideas, and people circulate across borders constantly. The challenges we face, how to maintain cultural identity while participating in global culture, how to manage international trade fairly, how to communicate across cultural and linguistic differences, aren't new. Silk Road merchants faced versions of these same challenges. Their solutions, successes, and failures offer valuable insights. Psychologically, Silk Road stories remind us of human capacities for courage, resilience, and adaptability. In an era where many of us live relatively comfortable and safe lives, there's something inspiring in stories of people who faced extraordinary challenges and persevered. Not that we should romanticize suffering. The hardships of the Silk Road were real and terrible, but there's value in recognizing that humans are capable of enduring much more than we often believe, that obstacles that seem insurmountable can be overcome with determination and creativity. Spiritually, for many who traveled the Silk Road, journeys were also pilgrimages, opportunities for spiritual growth, for testing faith, for seeking meaning beyond material profit. This spiritual dimension of travel, the idea that physical journeys can also be inner journeys, resonates through cultural traditions to this day. The metaphor of life as a journey, with its challenges and transformations, is universal precisely because it resonates with real experiences of travelers throughout history. Environmentally, the Silk Road demonstrates how climate and environmental changes can affect human societies. Some sections of the route became less viable as climate changed, oases dried up, or deserts expanded. Cities that prospered for centuries were eventually abandoned when environmental conditions shifted. These historical lessons about human vulnerability to environmental change are particularly relevant today, as we face climate change on a potentially transformative scale. The Silk Road teaches us that human connection across distances and differences is not only possible but beneficial. That trade can be a force for peace and mutual understanding, not just exploitation. That cultural diversity is a valuable resource, not a threat. That humans are simultaneously incredibly resilient and vulnerable, capable of extraordinary feats, but also susceptible to forces beyond our control. These lessons, learned through centuries of trade and exchange along routes that spanned continents, remain profoundly relevant to our modern, globalized, interconnected world, a world that, in many ways, the Silk Road merchants helped create. We've reached the end of this journey through the Silk Road, but perhaps it's more appropriate to say we've arrived at a point of pause, not a true end. Because the stories we've explored, the challenges we've examined, the human connections we've discovered, all of this continues to echo through time, shaping our present in subtle and profound ways. When we began this narrative, we talked about transporting gifts from ancient times. Now, reflecting on everything we've discovered, we can see that the true gifts weren't just the physical goods, silks, spices, gemstones, but something far more enduring and transformative. The first gift the Silk Road offers us is perspective. We live in an era of accelerated globalization, where we can communicate instantly with people on the other side of the planet, where goods cross oceans in days, where cultures mix and influence each other constantly. It's easy to think this is a new phenomenon, that globalization is a modern invention. But the Silk Road shows us that humans have sought connection across vast distances for millennia. The tools have changed, camels replaced by airplanes, foot messengers, by instant internet. But the fundamental impulses remain the same. The desire to exchange, to know the unknown, to benefit from others' specialization, to share what we have that's unique. These are universal human impulses that transcend time and technology. The second gift is humility. When you truly absorb the scale of the Silk Road's achievements, people crossing thousands of kilometers through some of the planet's harshest terrain, without modern technology, without elaborate support systems, often without even accurate maps, it's impossible not to feel admiration and respect. These weren't superhumans with capabilities we don't possess. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, doing the best they could with limited resources, failing often but persisting anyway. Their accomplishments remind us not to underestimate human capacity for resilience, creativity, and determination. But they also remind us of our limits. How many died trying? How many failed? How much suffering was required to create these trade networks? Success came at an enormous cost, paid in human and animal lives, in years of family separation, in hardships we can barely imagine. The third gift is appreciation. When you truly understand what it took to transport a roll of silk from China to Rome, or spices from India to Europe, you'll never look at objects the same way again. Every object has a story, a journey embedded in its very existence. Today, when you buy something made on the other side of the world, it's easy to take it for granted. You click, pay, and days later, it arrives at your door. But behind that apparent simplicity is an incredibly complex system of logistics, transportation, communication, and coordination that's in many ways a direct heir to the systems developed along the Silk Road. Appreciating that complexity, recognizing the human labor and ingenuity that makes it possible, transforms passive consumption into active acknowledgement of global interconnectedness. The fourth gift is understanding that cultural difference isn't an insurmountable obstacle. Silk Road merchants didn't have the luxury of interacting only with people like themselves. Success depended on the ability to work with people who spoke different languages, practiced different religions, had radically different customs. And they managed, not perfectly, not without conflicts, but they managed to create systems of trade and exchange that worked for centuries. This should give us hope today, when cultural differences sometimes seem to create insurmountable divides. If ancient merchants could find ways to communicate and cooperate across far greater differences than those we face now, surely we can too. The fifth gift is recognition of interdependence. No region along the Silk Road was self-sufficient. Each produced some things exceptionally well and depended on other regions for other needs. This interdependence created incentives for cooperation, for maintaining peace, for facilitating trade. When your well-being depends on trade relations with distant regions, you have an interest in those regions prospering. This principle is even truer today, when national economies are deeply intertwined. Understanding historical interdependence helps us appreciate contemporary interdependence and, hopefully, work towards systems that benefit all participants, not just some. The sixth gift is awareness of fragility. The Silk Road didn't last forever. Political, climatic, technological, and economic changes eventually transformed or eliminated many of the routes. Cities that prospered for centuries were abandoned. Trade systems that seemed permanent collapsed. This reminds us that nothing is guaranteed, that systems that seem solid can be more fragile than we imagine. Our own globalized civilization, impressive as it is also vulnerable to climate change, political instability, pandemics, economic collapses. Historical lessons about the fragility of complex systems should motivate us to build resilience, not to take stability for granted, to work actively to maintain and improve the systems we depend on. The seventh gift is inspiration, stories of courage, of people facing the impossible and sometimes triumphing, have the power to inspire us in our own lives. You may not be crossing physical deserts or climbing literal mountains, but we all face our own challenges, obstacles that seem insurmountable, goals that seem impossible, fears that paralyze us. Silk Road stories remind us that humans have faced and overcome extraordinary challenges throughout history. If they could persist through months of hardship without guarantee of success, perhaps you can persist through your own challenges. It's not about comparing hardships. Your suffering is valid regardless of how it stacks up against historical suffering, but about recognizing that human capacity for resilience is greater than we often believe. The eighth gift is connection to the past. In a world that often seems focused only on the present and future, there's value in recognizing connections to those who came before. The Silk Road merchants are your ancestors, not necessarily biological, but certainly cultural and civilizational. The world you inhabit was shaped by their actions, their choices, their sacrifices. When you wear silk, eat spices, appreciate art, showing influences from multiple cultures, you're experiencing direct legacies of the Silk Road. Recognizing these connections creates a sense of continuity, of being part of a larger human story stretching across millennia. The ninth gift is questioning of assumptions. Studying history, especially history of cultures and periods very different from our own, forces us to question assumptions about how things should be. You assume certain aspects of your life are natural or inevitable, but history shows that almost everything about how we live is contingent, the result of specific choices and circumstances that could have been different. This isn't nihilistic. It doesn't mean nothing matters. It means we have more agency than we sometimes recognize, that alternative futures are possible, that we're not stuck continuing to do things the way they've always been done. The 10th and perhaps most important gift is hope. Yes, Silk Road history includes tremendous suffering, injustice, violence, death, but it also includes extraordinary cooperation across differences, human creativity overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles, beauty created and shared, knowledge expanded and disseminated, connections forged across vast distances. Humans are capable of terrible things, but also of wonderful things. The Silk Road is testimony to both capacities. And if our ancestors could create networks of trade and cultural exchange spanning continents using only pack animals and human determination, imagine what we can create today with all the technological tools at our disposal, if we choose to use those tools to connect rather than divide, to build rather than destroy, to understand rather than fear. As you close your eyes tonight, perhaps think about your own journey. Not the physical journey you may or may not take, but the journey through life. What are your deserts, periods of difficulty that seem endless? What are your mountains, challenges that seem insurmountable? What are your oases, moments of rest and renewal? Who are your caravan companions, people traveling alongside you, sharing burdens and joys? And what gifts are you carrying, not just for yourself, but for others, for the future? Each of us is on a journey, carrying something of value, facing obstacles, seeking destinations that are sometimes clear and sometimes nebulous. The specifics have changed since the days of the Silk Road, but the fundamental patterns of human experience remain remarkably consistent. The Silk Road merchants didn't know they were creating a legacy that would last millennia. They were simply living their lives, doing their work, trying to survive, and perhaps prosper. But collectively, through countless individual journeys, They created something larger than any one of them, a network of human connection that transformed the world. You too are creating a legacy even if you don't realize it. Your actions, your choices, your interactions with others all contribute to the larger fabric of human experience that will extend beyond your life. What kind of legacy do you want to leave? What gifts do you want to carry across time for those who come after you? These are questions to contemplate as you rest, letting the Silk Road stories settle into your consciousness, perhaps influencing your dreams, certainly expanding your understanding of how interconnected we all are, across space and time, across cultures and differences, united by shared humanity that transcends all superficial divisions. Good night, traveler. May your journey, whatever it is, be safe and meaningful.